Please welcome developer Onett, Piercen Harbut.
Test. Hello. My name is Piercen Harbut. Roblox username Onett or Onett. Both are fine. And I'm the developer of Beastswarm Simulator. So originally I was asked to speak on just creating the perfect first-time user experience in general, and I was very surprised when they asked me to do that because I never thought of Beastswarm as having a particularly good one. It doesn't really have a tutorial, but that got me to thinking about what it does do successfully. And what I came up with is that it really relies more on cultivating an early sense of intrigue and curiosity in players fast to accomplish the three primary goals of that first-time user experience, which are to convince players to play in the first place, then to help users teach themselves how to play, and finally to convince players to return. Oops, I'm not standing in the right place. Oops. So for those that don't know, a little bit about Beastswarm Simulator. It's a resource collection, clicker simulator game, and by simulator I mean like incremental Roblox style one, in which you build a swarm of cartoony bees with unique abilities to help you collect pollen from flowers and convert it into honey by shovels, stuff like that. It was inspired primarily by Snow Shoveling Simulator by Lauderman 23 and FM Trick, but also by old school tycoon games, grindy MMOs I played growing up like Maple Story, and Pokemon with the emphasis on critter collecting. It was released in March of 2018, has about 2 billion visits and 5 million favorites. Okay, so creating intrigue begins in the initial moments of exposure to your experience. So first I want to talk about the importance of first impressions. Why are they so important? Well, obviously players are incredibly busy. Now more than ever, it's more competitive than before on Roblox. They've got all of these super polished experiences fighting for the player's time. These are just some stats about the top 250 games. They have really great retention. So you're competing not only with those, but also with all the other apps out there and social media with super advanced content algorithms. And so if you don't stand out from those, then your game doesn't even have a chance. The way you do that, I think, on Roblox in particular, is recognizing what the audience does. On Roblox, they tend to move around as a transient social horde, guided by familiar genres, of course, to games that they already probably know will be worth the time investment, but at the same time, fundamentally seeking something new. They're looking for novelty. So your success in the initial moments depends on maintaining a paradoxical balance of luring players in with something familiar while clearly demonstrating that your game is unique. It's different from all the others and they should give it a chance, and that's difficult to do. So how do you do that? I think in general, you need to start by trying your best to make as alluring of an experience as possible. An engaging experience with incredible gameplay means nothing if players don't join, so you have to think about the initial presentation and the style and the character, the fundamental character of your game that you're trying to express, and how that sets your game apart. I think there's tons of well-made games that kind of get lost in the crowd because they put more emphasis onto perfectly executing a pre-existing style or perhaps a preconceived one or a borrowed one than they do into thinking about how theirs will actually be different. And but that's easier to do or easier said than done. I think in general for Beastswarm, I think I decided not to shy away from bold stylistic decisions. I wanted its appearance to be super overwhelmingly cute, teeming with stuff going on, so that as soon as you saw the icon, you see like a ton of critters and characters just popping out at you. I wanted it to be very approachable, but I also wanted it to embrace its quirks and to embrace my quirks and limitations as a developer and try to turn that into part of its character. So I stuff like a handcrafted appearance with the building, but also with the faces of the bees and stuff like that. The music as well, I wanted it to be very personable. I wanted it to be catchy, but also a little strange at the same time, a little bit peculiar, and even a little bit abrasive. But that's somewhat intentional to make it stick out in your mind. And but more generally, I think for other people's games, you're just trying to design to evoke some visceral, very basic sensation that strikes people fast. That's your starting point. It could be stuff like, just charm, wonder. You could base it off of some really novel mechanic, fear, or just absurd or strange situations. Those are the kind of visceral things I'm talking about. So an important point I want to make is that I think you're trying to intrigue players to your game with that first impression more than you're necessarily trying to impress them. Like, you're trying to leave a strong impression, but not necessarily technically impress them. And I think that the truth is most successful Roblox games are relatively rough around the edges. They have UX that's a little counterintuitive, and the art may be amateurish. I'm talking about my game as well. Bugs and glitches aren't unexpected. That's changing as things become more polished. But these things haven't really hurt Roblox games in the past. In fact, I think those quirks are almost sort of a mark of authenticity. They signal to players that they don't really know what they're in for, and that in itself is intriguing. So, one of the greatest strengths of Roblox, and one of the reasons why I wanted to develop on it, was that you don't really have to compete with the larger gaming industry on their own terms. Players are looking for something different, not a level of polish. There isn't a hurdle of that level of polish. Instead, they're looking for something a little more personable, a little bit more spontaneous, imaginative, kind of like the games you've come up with your friends, just like on the playground growing up. Sometimes with ill-defined or counterintuitive rules, but out of that stuff comes unexpected situations and unexpected types of plays and genres that are fun when you didn't even expect it to be. So for B-Swarm, how do I try to intrigue players? I think it relies on kind of this sense of deceptive familiarity. Like, I wanted the game to be familiar to get those hordes from the like snow shoveling simulator over to my game. I wanted to signal that they already knew what it was about. So it's familiar in that sense with the name simulator, but also with the theme. I think bees and bears, they're super cute and they're approachable. They kind of transcend cultures, and so I wanted that to be familiar. The deceptive part is more about how I think what really keeps people at B-Swarm, keeps bringing people in, is originality and hidden complexities and undertones. Those are what's really more substantial about it. If you were successful at intriguing people to join your game, then I think you have to keep the momentum of that intrigue going, and you can never let that flame burn out, because once it's burned out, they've got so many other options, they'll probably never come back. In B-Swarm, I do that by building with the first-time user experience explicitly in mind, and I'm talking about stuff like the architecture of the map. So when you first load in, I wanted the first thing you see to be the hives, where all the players go and hatch their bees and convert pollen into honey, so that you're immediately exposed to the large variety of colorful faces and stuff to come in the game. And I wanted experienced players to constantly be coming back to that starting hub to kind of demonstrate what you can become. I wanted sight lines to be, they were very intentional, so that when you first looked around the map, you would see all of these characters, NPCs, and machines off in the distance, kind of already beckoning you to explore and get your mind racing about what you could possibly run into in this game. On a larger scale, I just wanted B-Swarm to have a very structured feel, so I had these gated zones to always have something just around the bend. It's not overwhelming because the gates are kind of your primary objective. You have stuff within each zone that are kind of side objectives, but that guidance, that structure, I think is important for not blowing out that flame of curiosity, because otherwise it can be a little overwhelming. So essentially, your goal in this initial first impression stage, when they first load in, is just to make players curious, not to overload them with information. And I think for that reason, I tried to keep the core game loop as intuitive and nearly self-explanatory as possible. So like when you load in, there's an arrow that takes you to your hive, says go to the fields and collect some pollen and come back and convert it to honey. Right now, you're just establishing like a baseline labor that they'll overcome and compare progression against. You'll iterate on that later on, you'll build upon it, but you need to start basically as simple as possible, as I'm saying. The goal is to make players immediately curious about this apparent playground of gameplay potential. You know, I want the feeling of when you walk into an amusement park and you're seeing rides off in the distance and landmarks from different zones, and that gets you curious. That, to me, is intriguing. So if they've loaded in and you've intrigued them enough, the next step is to help them learn how to play. And in BSwarm, I think, you know, like I said, it doesn't have much of a true tutorial. You're kind of just bombarded with a slideshow of information when you first load in that most people don't even look at. But still, they're capable of learning how to play. And I think that's because it uses the player's own curiosity to kind of guide them around an exploratory process that feels like a natural part of gameplay. It doesn't feel like you're being lectured to or having to memorize a bunch of stuff. And you know, I think this style of learning, it's more fun because you don't really feel like you're learning, you're just doing it. And it also establishes kind of a foundational trust between players and developers. I think you know, the developer is putting trust into the player to figure things out on their own and at a pace that's comfortable for them. And if that works, then the player knows that they're in good hands. This is a designer that knows what they're doing. So in BSwarm, you know, that I start by having a starting zone that is open. It seems much more open than it actually is at first, but it's intentionally designed and simple so that players kind of stumble upon things in an order that makes sense. And for example, you know, the shops you should access first and the NPCs you should access first, they're placed closer with more sightline. And like the flower fields that you first go to, they begin with mostly simple white flowers. They're the basic flowers, singular ones, but scattered throughout them is like double flowers and some colored ones. So as players are digging around, they can start to see for themselves that if I dig over here, I'm making more. And the concept of pod multipliers starts they become familiar with it. And as you're digging, sometimes like little leaves pop out in certain places. And if you dig around the leaves, then you might be rewarded with something like this treat token. And the items aren't explained to you other than a very short description in the egg menu. But that's how players are introduced to concepts to mechanics like leveling up your bees and bee stats and stuff. Once you get a little bolder and venture out a little bit more, then like you get ambushed by a ladybug, but it's not very threatening. Your bees start defending you right away, and that eases you into combat. In general, though, this type of space, I think, it's designed so that players can't make any permanent mistakes, and as they become familiar with what you've introduced to them, they themselves get a little bolder, they themselves venture out a little bit more, do a little more exploring, and then they learn something a little more complicated. To help them through this process, I like to place little rewards all around the map to encourage exploration. This is also how players are introduced to different types of bees, like these royal jelly tokens. They're what you use to transform your bees into better or rarer ones. They're placed as rewards for obbies or just incentives for exploration to make traveling around more meaningful, but also to steer players to locations that they otherwise wouldn't have gone to. With those sight lines in mind, they're very visible from the start as well. And you know, they themselves build a sense of anticipation. You see them behind the gate, and you realize if I could just get this many bees, I could get all of these little tokens that I clearly see in the distance. One of the greatest tools you have at your disposal, though, as a Roblox game is just allowing other players to teach new players how to play. Games that would otherwise be probably single-player experiences, like tycoon games, suddenly become social because other people are playing, and you suddenly have teachers for everyone because you have examples from the experienced players. So I kept this in mind with BSwarm, and I decided to have most of the map visible to early game players so that they can always observe the advanced players' movement patterns and what types of bees they have, what type of equipment they have. And that type of learning is just kind of osmotic and passive. We do it all the time as social beings, but it's still fun because sometimes you can feel like you're discovering a shortcut or something or some hidden thing. And so that's like the passive way of doing it, but you can also design systems to kind of explicitly get the advanced players or the experienced ones to explain things to new ones, like in chat, like this vicious bee here. Everyone benefits if vicious bee is defeated, so that gets the, what I'm talking about. Okay, just in case they're not picking things up on their own, I think you should have information readily available. For example, all of the bears in Bee Swarm Simulator kind of act as long-term extended tutorials for different systems, like Mother Bear here teaches you about treats and raising your bees levels and stuff, scattered in with flavor text and stuff. And in an absolute worst case scenario, you can refer to that slideshow I was talking about. There's this emergency button in the top corner that just goes over the basics. So during this process, I think one of the key points I'm wanting to make is that you can't overwhelm players. You can't give them a space that's too open because that becomes a burden. They have to figure out too much at once. And something you should consider is your progression curves. Stuff like how much the scale, the cost of items scales as you progress, or the amount of experience you need to level up. I think in this first time experience, you want to cycle players through the core game loop many times just to prove that it's fun, but also to solidify an understanding of it. And then that will gradually scale later on. The goal during this teaching experience is just to design a space that encourages players to explore without overwhelming them and make learning a side effect of that exploration. If you've accomplished that, I think your final goal in the first session is just to convince them to come back. There are some kind of more obvious mechanics that I use in Bee Swarm to accomplish this. Stuff like time-gated randomized rewards, which are everywhere. They're omnipresent in Bee Swarm. Stuff like the loot you get from monsters when you defeat them, like this spider here. Sometimes it drops a ton of tickets, but you can only defeat it once every 30 minutes. Or like mini games, you can only play every 2 hours. This is a very straightforward way, and quest lines that are obviously going to take longer than one session. But I also like to introduce early on a bunch of long-term recurring benchmarks that kind of infinitely scale, that players can keep returning back to and measuring their progress. Like this ant challenge here, you defeat as many ants as you can in 5 minutes, and depending on how many you defeat, you get a certain tier of reward, like a certain tier of amulet. And the desire to see how far you can keep pushing it and how much it's changed is a big part of why people continue to play. I think they're benchmarks for progression, but they're also meanings for progression. Suddenly leveling your bees does more than just help you make more honey. It also helps you defeat more ants or pop more puff shrooms or take down sprouts faster. And then once again, as a Roblox game, the social aspect is probably your strongest tool. There's no better way to get someone to return than to clearly demonstrate to them everything that's possible, and other players do that almost instantaneously. I think the sense of social aspiration, always or maybe even like social envy. Advanced players that are given highly visible powers, access to places that new players can't go. They inspire new players to reach those same milestones because they want to know what that power feels like themselves. And this is something that's used all over Roblox. Kind of a classic example is like the winners booths at the end of obbies or or minecart games or something like that. They have droppers and stuff that give you like paths that suddenly allow you to break the rules of the game, fly wherever you want, even mess with other people in certain cases. But that's the whole reason you continue to go, because you want to feel what that power feels like yourself. And yeah. But on a broader level, I think what you're trying to accomplish is just establishing a space of potential in players' minds. And you do that by introducing systems early on and hinting towards their possibilities. And each hint kind of broadens that space. I'm talking about kind of a mental map of your game that's different from the visual one. You've got to keep that broad, or else your game can start to feel very linear or start to feel like a mile wide and an inch deep, stuff like that. And so in BStorm, I do that by using stuff like the gates and the machines I mentioned with vaguely described effects and requirements. You know when you first get introduced to like the red cannon that you need 25 bees discovered, but you don't necessarily know what the cannon is good for. But that just puts this kind of long-term goal in the back of your mind, mysterious path that you could go down. And then also stuff like just having information available long before it will actually be useful to players. Like in the bee menu, you can read the stats and abilities of all the bees, even the very late game ones. And if you're curious, begin to see for yourself how the abilities of like the mythic bees, like Vector Bee, his ability synergizes with Stubborn Bee, which is like a rare bee that you would get earlier on. And that starts to broaden that space of potential. So yeah, you're hinting at the long term. And I think in BStorm, I tried to do that by having mechanics that sort of unravel as you get to each new zone. They reveal a little bit more of themselves to you. And so like when you first go into the starter shop, for example, purchasing equipment, most of the equipment only costs honey, but there's a few in there like this helmet that have a few crafting ingredients that informs you that items sometimes have secondary effects, in this case crafting. And like the helmet here has very intuitive stats like plus 10% pollen, plus 25% defense, but then hidden behind the starter shop is a late game mask, not the gummy mask here, but the demon mask, very similar. It has absolutely absurd costs. Like you would think, could anyone ever possibly achieve this? And the list of stat modifiers is absolutely insane and has strange ones that aren't, you can't quite connect what that has to do with the game about making honey. But I think by kind of teasing that out of order or anachronistically or something like that, you demonstrate that your game will expand into something more cohesive later on. And I think, kind of going back to that, those vitriolic sensations I was talking about, I wanted to occasionally just shock people and make them feel like this is impossible. What is he thinking? That's intentional because it is possible. But yeah. So the process of gameplay actually evolving and getting revealed to you creates a sensation as you progress of completing a puzzle, seeing the cohesive whole of what this game is, and at the same time, it also it also shows how the game will qualitatively transform, or evolve, but yeah, shift and transform. Like the core game loops, for example, just collecting pollen from fields. First, it starts with just you, mostly with your shovel, and maybe a few basic bees that you're doing most of the work. And then later on, it becomes more about collecting the ability tokens of your bees and stacking their multipliers, and your shovel isn't as important. And then later on, the process of collecting tokens becomes trivialized, and then it's more about positioning on the field or a higher level balancing of consumables. And even further than that, as you spec into late game hives, it could be about popping bubbles or flames or something, but the point is that what you're actually doing out in the field is morphing. It's not just more of the same as you progress. It's not just the numbers scaled up. And I think you need those types of shifts to keep an experience feeling spontaneous. People will, And that increased complexity is a reward in itself. It feels very good once you've internalized something that felt so chaotic at first, and you see through the chaos. That's an accomplishment, and it makes you proud of what you've done and proud of the game if it has a lot of depth to it. You become more loyal to that game. But so the key point really that I'm trying to make is that you have to demonstrate within that first session that there's more to it than can be deciphered in that first session. that applies to mechanics. I think there's a lot of games, for example, that after 5 or 6 hours, they turn into really engaging experiences with amazing game loops, but no one will get to that point, and that's where they fall flat. So proving that the game will continue to surprise you and subvert your expectations. You can do this with stuff like just randomized events, like in Beaststorm, sometimes it turns nighttime and then you're chasing fireflies, or sometimes there's a honey storm and you're just running around collecting a bunch of tokens all of a sudden. And then stuff like Easter eggs, like just little mazes hidden around the map, or strange bosses, and abrupt shifts in music and tone, things that catch people off guard, but keep the realm of possibility in your game broad. Because if that starts to shrink down, then that's when they move on to the next one. There is no more novelty to decipher. And so in Beaststorm, I was constantly trying to balance, I don't want to deviate too far from what people are familiar with, but I want to morph it and stretch it in ways that they didn't even know they would enjoy, and just throw things out there sometimes and see what sticks. And I think that kind of ties back towards that spontaneity that was kind of just a feature of Roblox in general. I think, never knowing what you're in for because it was just some random person or some random kid that made the experience is part of why people continue to jump into new experiences. And for Beaststorm, I just wanted to kind of stretch that out over something that could last weeks or months. So in conclusion, why is Beaststorm successful in those initial sessions? I think it's exactly because of this. It gets players curious and it keeps that going. It uses it from the start with the style and the icon. I wanted it to have something about it that people couldn't quite figure out, and that draws them in to explore and try to make sense of it. And during that exploration, they're learning how to play and getting familiar with the loops, and during that teaching process, just surprising them a little bit, demonstrating that the game will qualitatively evolve so that they'll want to continue to explore long into future sessions. And this is something that obviously applies to Beaststorm, but I think it applies to game design in general, especially anything with world building, anything where you want players to have a real commitment to your experience. So thanks for listening to my game design talk.